Hello, world, and welcome to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterlin, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is episode 239. Wild, woolly, and action-packed. No, it's not some 80s buddy cop film. It is the latest batch of Gen X nostalgia for your listening pleasure. The show kicks off with the latest installment of Blink and You'll Miss It Retro, featuring food and drink products that were here and gone in a flash. We're going to go way back in the day to look at the creation of TiVo. You all remember TiVo? There's going to be a brand new top 5 as we look at the top 5 best 1980s synth pop bands. And there's going to be a brand new This Week in History and Time capsule, looking back at the very first animated film, Humorous Phases of Funny Faces. All of that is coming up right now on episode 239 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Welcome in, everybody. Yes, this is not a buddy cop film. It is Gen X nostalgia. Who would my partner be if it was a buddy cop film? All of you listening to be very cheesy? That's one of those type of questions you post on social media to get loads of engagement. If you were going to be in an 80s buddy cop film, who would your partner be? Before we go too far off on a tangent, thank you all for tuning in. I hope you will enjoy this latest batch of Gen X nostalgia pop culture to bring you back to your childhoods. If your childhoods were anywhere from the 1960s to the early 2000s. As you heard in the rundown, I've got a lot of fun stuff here. But before we get into the meat of this podcast sandwich, I can't start off without thanking my biggest fans, my biggest backers, my Patreon subscribers. Thank you to Laurie, Mary Lou, Ashley, Kevin, Leo, Marguerite, Neglectoid, Crystal, Matt, Dr. Shrimp Porto Chico. Thank you all for literally putting your money where your mouth is to support me, my never-ending quest to be a full-time self-employed content creator. Each day it gets a little closer, even if it's just a few cents. What I mean is that I'm actually earning little bits of money for my reels and my carousel of photos on Instagram. And now I've been invited to do the same on TikTok, where I can partner up with local brands, local establishments. It may only add up to a couple of cups of coffee at the end of the month, but it's more than most people. You too can become a member on Patreon for $5 a month. You get access to bonus podcast episodes, the members only podcast. I finally gave it a name after like 2.5 years of having a Patreon page. Members only, as in it's only for members, but also members only like the jacket from the 1980s. You get super duper early access to the hidden track bonus podcasts. The first hidden track that I did debuted at the beginning of 2026, and just this past week it went up on the main podcast feed. So you get a 3-month head start. You also get access to the Remastered Without a Map live streams, early access to YouTube videos. The latest project that I'm going to be doing for Patreon only is the audio version of my 1996, The Year That Changed Everything blogs. Because it's been now 30 years since I graduated high school, I'm doing like a comprehensive series of blogs about not just my life at that time and how it's kind of a crossroads of life between childhood and adulthood, but also just what was going on in the world in 1996. The first one I did was about how the internet changed the world, because that was the year that my family got internet. So I'm going to be doing basically short form podcasts of these blogs. Those will be just for Patreon. Not sure when, because it's throughout the year, so at any point this year, like giving myself an out. There's a lot more to get into as far as housekeeping goes, but I don't want to drag it out. I want to get you into the actual podcast proper. So let's kick this off by looking at part 6 of the Blink and You'll Miss It Retro series, food and drink that came and went. So let's go get into it. So here we are again. Blink and You'll Miss It Retro Part 6, the segment that is named after basically the placeholder name that I put at the top of my Word document. By the time I get to about part 50 of this series, it'll have a better name. It basically is what the title says. These are things that came and went in a flash. I've grouped them into categories that we can then share on the podcast. Those of you longtime listeners know that Blink and You'll Miss It Retro, it's a 6-pack of similar topics. We've done other ones, toys, TV shows. I think we even did food before. I do the hard work. I scour the depths of the internet, watching countless hours of old commercial compilations to find things that I remember or maybe don't remember. We collect them and we go over them here. I know it's a hard job, but somebody's got to do it. With these food and drink products, some of these you might remember. One of them I remembered vividly. I saw a commercial for it in a compilation and said, oh man, I can't believe that wasn't around longer. All right, so let's pop open the top on this 6-pack here. The first product on this installment of Blink and You'll Miss It Retro was Sun Country wine coolers.
You see, Sun Country is a blend of premium white wine and real fruit juice. That's what gives it its great taste. Sun Country, say, give me the real juice cooler. If you don't say Sun Country, you'd better sleep with your lights on.
These were around roughly from 1984 to 1991. There was a time, especially in the mid-later 80s, where everywhere you looked there was a new brand of wine coolers. Seagram's, Bartles and James. Seagram's had Bruce Willis singing the theme song. I know, that's a very 80s sentence right there. So what do you do to stand out in the dog-eat-dog world of wine cooler battles in the 1980s? You mix your wine with fruit. These were known for being refreshing and fizzy. The big thing was that they were sold in 2-liter bottles. Do you imagine going into the store and buying a 2-liter of wine cooler, just sit out on the corner and chug it and wonder where your life went? Sun Country did its best to try to make a mark. Their advertisements in the mid-80s had people like Ringo Starr, Patrick Duffy, Grace Jones. Grace Jones was terrifying to me as a kid. She was scarier than Freddy Krueger. Though fondly remembered by Gen Xers for being kind of a staple of parties, Sun Country wine coolers vanished in 1991 or thereabouts due to tax increases. So it's like people liked them, but not enough to pay a little more. Although I will say there were rumors recently as 2024, that Constellation Brands, who own the Sun Country wine cooler trademark and probably the recipe, had been considering bringing it back. Everything 80s, 90s is in fashion again, so you never know if you might see it on shelves again in the next few years. The second product here on Blink and You'll Miss It Retro was Lipton Golden Sauté.
And I cannot afford to be chained to the stove. So we use this now, Golden Sauté. It's new. I can leave it on the stove, I can walk away from it, and Golden Sauté is still going to be perfect.
These were a rice dish by Lipton, proclaimed as sauté taste without the skillet. These came out in 1991. They came in typical flavors, chicken, beef, Asian style. People that were having it at the beginning said it reminded them a lot of rice-a-roni, which therein lies the issue. If you created a new product that tastes like a established product that's already out there, you're already in trouble. The product did not last that long. We're looking at maybe 5 years. By the mid-1990s, I was reading an article from the archives of Supermarket News. Did you subscribe to Supermarket News magazine? But the reports in 1995 were that sales of Lipton Golden Sauté were sluggish, mainly because people compared it to rice-a-roni, and you are more likely to stick with the tried and true that you know than change over. I was reading in this article that specialty rices were the big thing in the early 90s. So Lipton tried, Lipton failed, but they still had cup of soup, they still had their onion dip mix. They had their teas, but those don't taste like onions. If you didn't have Sun Country wine cooler to wash down your Golden Sauté, maybe you could grab yourself a bottle of Quirst soda.
Introducing Quirst lemonade-flavored drink.
Whenever I want to quench my thirst, I feel like a Quirst. I feel like a Quirst.
Feel like a Quirst.
I feel like a Quirst.
Feel like a Quirst.
Quirst was introduced in 1978 by the 7-Up company, back when 7-Up was its own independent brand. It was a lemon-lime soda. When you're trying to enter something like the soda market, you need to have a unique item and really do your due diligence to make sure you don't infringe on anyone's copyrights, because that's what happened to Quirst. In 1980, only 2 years after debuting, Quirst and the 7-Up company were sued for copyright infringement by Squirt Co. because they said Quirst was too close to their soda named Squirt. They weren't the same. Squirt was a grapefruit-flavored soda. Still, it's amazing to see all of these new products that companies try to get away with stuff. Last week when I did the Forgotten 1970s Soda segment, you'll remember I mentioned Peppo, which was basically a Dr. Pepper ripoff created by the Coca-Cola company, and they were immediately sued. That's kind of what happened to Quirst. They had about 2 years that they were able to sell before they got sued, and within a year, by 1981, Quirst was gone. It just lives on in the memories of kids that grew up in the late 70s. The one out of this 6 that I remember vividly is Boku, the juice drink.
And can you believe she wouldn't even let me go to the juice box aisle, and she'd drive by the supermarket to see if my car was parked outside. I hear now she's seeing a juice box counselor. All I wanted was a Boku.
Boku fruit juice cooler from McCain.
Is that too much to ask?
This one might be a little bit of a cheat, and I only say that because Boku technically was out for 13 years, from 1990 to 2003. But be honest, when do you think, if you remember Boku, when do you think that it was out? Early 90s, right? That's the only time I can remember seeing ads for it. Those were the ones with comedian Richard Lewis raving about how great Boku was. Boku was marketed as an adult juice box. Like, is that really needed? It looked just like the Minute Maid juice boxes. They weren't adult in that they had alcohol. It was just like meant to give grown-ups a reason to go buy juice boxes. Like, if I want a juice box, I'm going to go get one. I'm not going to be shamed out of it. Like, look at that old guy with the gray beard. He's buying juice boxes. Like, that's going to make me put it back. It's like I'm old. I don't give a crap anymore. Boku was created by the McCain company, the one with the microwave fries. And those ads, they were everywhere in the early 90s, maybe the mid-90s. Always Richard Lewis, who just wanted to have a juice box for an adult. And it would end with him saying, "Is that too much to ask?" So these adult juice boxes didn't have booze in them, but they did have a pull tab instead of a straw. Ooh, there you go. That's what makes it adult. Although I guess they probably saw the struggles that people had with the Capri Sun straws, and they didn't want adults stabbing themselves, so they just gave them the pull tab. The 5th item on Blink and You'll Miss It Retro is when they were capitalizing on being healthy. This was the Hershey New Trail granola bars.
You've just had your first taste of a New Trail chocolate chip granola bar. How do you feel?
You knocked me out right off of my feet.
What about you?
My secret dreams.
It's so dumb. Like, being healthy becomes a fad. These were out in the mid-1980s. It's kind of when all of the granola bars came out, the Quaker ones, Nature Valley, Kudos, that had the song that will get stuck in your head.
Kudos, I'm yours, I'm yours.
Yay, now you'll have to hear that in your brain all day. There honestly wasn't much special about these granola bars. You had the Hershey name, but all the flavors were what you would find with everything else. Chocolate chip, peanut butter, honey graham, cinnamon. I mean, I don't know what you could make as far as weird flavors of granola bars. I'm sure there are some. But when you're one in a sea of possibly dozens of different granola bar brands and flavors, it's going to be hard to make a mark, even if it's Hershey. Another reason why these might have been pulled from the market, or at least had their sales go down a lot, is an article I found from the Washington Post in 1987 about peanuts being mistakenly placed in some of these New Trail bars. triggering allergic reactions from those with peanut allergies. I would say all it would take is one bite and getting an allergic reaction to be like, I'll never have that again, and you'll tell everyone you know, watch out. It is amazing to see like the simple things that become fads, like just being healthy became a fad in the 80s, or today the stupid protein fad at Starbucks. Like, oh my God, I just roll my eyes. But we'll wrap up this 6-pack of nostalgia with the last food that came and went. Borden cheese kisses. Think Hershey Kisses but cheese instead, which sounds good if you're looking for that. These first came out in 1972. They made it into the early 1980s, and I guess they were trying to be hip by spelling cheese with a Z. Or they could just make it where it's not real cheese and say, look, we didn't write cheese the right way. And yes, it is kind of that. It's sort of like Cheese Whiz, smushed into a little kiss. They were branded as either mild or tangy, cheddar spread kisses, convenience food, because nothing says good eating like a bag of cheese kisses. I couldn't find any information as far as how many calories were in each kiss. It's not the same, but a typical Hershey's Kiss has about 23 calories in it. I'm just saying, if they're that convenient and you eat a whole bag, it's like, what are you downing as far as calories go? I guess the world in the 1970s just wasn't ready for cheese kisses. The 80s saw more of a cheese craze with the Polly-O string cheese and then those little Baby Bell cheeses that are still around. Maybe if the Borden cheese kisses came back, they'd do well now. So there you go. Blink and You'll Miss It Retro Part 6, more food and drink that came and went. Do you remember any of these? People my age, I would assume, would remember the Boku drinks. And we'll do another segment like this sometime in the future, probably before the year ends. Maybe we'll go back to toys, or we'll go to TV shows again. We'll see. This week in history, we are going back 120 years to April 6, 1906, and the release of what is considered to be the very first ever animated film, Humorous Phases of Funny Faces. This 3-minute film changed the world. At the dawn of the 20th century, motion pictures were still a novelty. You had filmmakers experimenting with visual tricks, illusions, and different storytelling techniques. A man named J. Stuart Blackton, who was a British-American cartoonist and co-founder of the Vitagraph Company of America, was uniquely positioned to bridge two worlds, those being illustration and film. Released on April 6, 1906, Humorous Phases of Funny Faces emerged from a tradition known as lightning sketch, which it's live vaudeville acts where artists rapidly drew humorous images for audiences. Blackton adopted this concept into the film, combining live-action drawing with early animation techniques. And at the time, in 1906, there was no established method for animation, so what Blackton did was not just creative, it was experimental filmmaking at its most fundamental level. So what exactly goes on in Humorous Phases of Funny Faces? The film is simple but groundbreaking. It starts with a hand, which is Blackton's own, drawing a cartoon face on a chalkboard, and at first the drawing process is shown in live action. Then, magically, the drawings begin to move on their own. You've got key sequences like a man and a woman whose facial expressions change, a man who smokes a cigar and blows the smoke into the woman's face, a really creepy clown interacting with a small dog and performing tricks. The illusion of the animation was created by stopping the camera, altering the drawing, and then continuing to film, producing the appearance of motion when played back. What makes this film historically significant is the variety of animation techniques that it employs. Stop-motion animation, where Blackton used a frame-by-frame process, slightly altering drawings between shots, and then when projected, the changes created the illusion of movement. That's even what they did at the beginning of South Park, and that came out in the late 90s. You had cutout animations with sequences with the clown, using movable pieces. Again, much like South Park. Obviously, there was hand-drawn animation, there was mixed media, live action and animation. Film historians widely regard Humorous Phases of Funny Faces as the first animated film recorded on standard motion picture film. This distinction is important. Earlier devices like the zoetrope or magic lantern created motion illusions, but not on film. Earlier films like The Enchanted Drawing, which was also by Blackton, used trick effects but did not feature sustained animated movement. In short, this film marks the transition from visual trickery to intentional animation as a storytelling medium. This 3-minute film changed everything in the world of animation and entertainment. It paved the way for future pioneers of animations like Emile Cole, who did Phantasmagorie in 1908, Winsor McCay, who did Gertie the Dinosaur in 1914, and then the first superstar of animation, Walt Disney, who did his projects from the 1920s onward. Despite all of the good that it did, like bridging art and cinema and introducing character animation, there were limitations. Despite its importance, there's no continuous storyline, there's minimal character development, naturally, there's a short runtime of only 3 minutes, and it's silent and black and white. Despite those nitpicks, at 20 frames per second, it already approximated the smooth motion that would become standard in cinema. I highly recommend taking 3 minutes out just to watch Humorous Phases of Funny Faces. It proved that drawings could come to life, and from that concept grew the golden age of animation, feature-length animated films, television cartoons, and even modern digital animation and CGI. And that landmark piece of film, Humorous Phases of Funny Faces, was first released 120 years ago this week in history. Now it's time to animate a new time capsule. For this, we're going back 76 years to April 6, 1950. I chose this date because this was the time when the very first animated TV show came out, and that was Crusader Rabbit. What else was going on in the world of pop culture back then? Well, let's find out. The number one song was Music, Music, Music by Teresa Brewer. This became Teresa Brewer's signature song, earning her the nickname Miss Music. An interesting little story about this song is that a then New York morning radio host named Gene Rayburn lobbied for Teresa Brewer to record the song. Gene Rayburn, you may know, as the one who went on to become a beloved game show host, including on games like The Match Game. This was Brewer's only number one song. It was a million seller, but I say things like her only number one. It's like all you need is one. You imagine all the thousands of musicians that never even make the charts. The number one movie was Cinderella, and you could get into the theater with a ticket costing 46 cents. Speaking of landmark animation, here is the Disney film Cinderella. This is based on Charles Perrault's 1697 fairy tale about Cinderella, the daughter of a widowed aristocrat who was forced to become the servant for her evil stepmother and stepsisters. The film was a big hit even when it came out in 1950, making approximately $10 million on a budget of somewhere between $2 and $3 million. But due to all of the re-releases, video sales, in total, since its release, Cinderella has made around $182 million. Plus, it's 95% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, and we all know that that means everything. I say that sarcastically, but I use it with all of these time capsules, so I don't know what message I'm trying to send. The number one TV show was the Texaco Star Theater. This would later become known as the Milton Berle Show. It started on the radio from 1938 to 1949 before transitioning to television, where it ran from 1948 to 1956. It was a comedy variety show, things you would expect, sketches, musical numbers. But in the early days of television, this was the first big hit. In fact, during this season, the 1950 season, Not only was it number one in the ratings, but it had a 61.6 rating, basically meaning almost 2 out of every 3 televisions had on the Texaco Star Theater. And if you were around back then, April 6th, 1950, maybe you didn't want to stay at home and cook a meal in your state-of-the-art kitchen. Well, you're in luck. You could go out and get yourself a delicious meal at the Waldorf Cafeteria. This was the first lunchroom chain founded by Harry Seymour Kelsey in Springfield, Massachusetts. The first one opened in 1906 and spread to 7 states. At its peak, there were around 200 Waldorf Cafeteria locations in those 7 states, but mostly Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and upstate New York. So what were the deals that you could get at the Waldorf Cafeteria the week of April 6, 1950? Ocean fresh broiled mackerel with lemon butter, mixed green salad, nice warm rolls like my Nana used to say. That was 45 cents. 2 fish cakes with tomato sauce, Creole salad, and rolls for 35 cents. Fried scallops with tartar sauce that somehow has an E at the end of tartar. Coleslaw and a potato and rolls for 55 cents. In case you're wondering, when adjusted for inflation, that scallop plate would be $7.46 now. What does a scallop plate cost you? Like $30? Yeah, inflation can suck it. But that wraps up another time capsule, another This Week in History. We go from cafeteria-style foods of the 50s to synth pop bands of the 80s. So let's look at the best of the best in the brand new top 5. Some subgenres of music are so quintessentially linked to certain decades. Psychedelic rock is linked to the 60s, disco is linked to the 70s, grunge is linked to the 90s, nu metal is linked to the 2000s. I'm too old to know or care about what's linked to the 2020s. But as far as the 1980s goes, synth pop is that subgenre. Synth pop, the definition is it's a synthesized based or lead instrument as far as the music goes. These are the types of songs that when you hear them, you know exactly when they were recorded. And what we're going to do now is go through the top 5 best 1980s synth pop bands and artists. I will tell you, my top 5, even though it's in no particular order, it took me about 3 seconds to come up with all of these bands. The honorable mentions, which I've got also 5 of, these took a little longer and took a little more research. I was looking basically straight up on stats, their record sales, chart hits. I also did research to make sure that the bands and artists that I had in here were classified as synth pop, even if it was like the secondary way they were known. So let's just dive right in. Honorable mentions for best 1980s synth pop bands include The Human League. They are known for their hit songs Fascination, Human, Don't You Want Me. They are still touring to this day if you want some 80s memories thrown at you. Another honorable mention is ABC. No, not another bad creation who had the songs Aisha and Playground in the early 90s. They had big hits in the 1980s with songs like Be Near Me, The Look of Love, and When Smokey Sings. Their debut album, The Lexicon of Love, in 1982 sold over 1 million copies. Another honorable mention is Howard Jones. He had big hits with Things Can Only Get Better, No One Is to Blame, and also the hit song What Is Love. He has sold more than 10 million albums worldwide. Another honorable mention is the Pet Shop Boys. They are considered one of the best-selling synth pop bands ever, with hit songs West End Girls, What Have I Done to Deserve This? Estimates for their total albums sold range from anywhere from 25 to 100 million copies worldwide. But you'll see why they didn't crack the top 5. But before then, we've got one more honorable mention, and that is the Thompson Twins. They had big hits with Hold Me Now and Doctor Doctor, and have sold somewhere close to 10 million copies of their albums worldwide. Those are the honorable mentions. I will tell you, some of the total albums sold actually surprised me, especially that Pet Shop Boys one. But I couldn't find a definitive total number of albums sold, which was kind of why I left them in the honorable mentions. That, and you'll see this top 5 is a murderer's row of synth pop. So let's start it off with number 1, Depeche Mode. Depeche Mode was huge in the 1980s into the early 90s. They had a string of hit songs. Enjoy the Silence, Personal Jesus, Policy of Truth, People Are People. Even their more dancey song, Just Can't Get Enough, from their 1981 debut. In total, Depeche Mode has sold more than 100 million copies of their albums worldwide. Ironically, their biggest success came with their album Violator, which actually was released in March 1990. So even though it's 80s synth pop bands, Depeche Mode had their greatest success in the early 90s. Number 2 is the Eurythmics. This was a band fronted by Annie Lennox. When I first saw her in the video for Sweet Dreams Are Made of These, she was terrifying with her pasty white skin and short red hair. The Eurythmics were monsters of 80s synth pop with Sweet Dreams, like I said, Here Comes the Rain Again, There Must Be an Angel, Would I Lie to You, Sisters Are Doing It for Themselves. Even though Annie Lennox was basically the front of this duo, David Stewart, who was the main musician guitarist, even he had a good solo run. He had a hit instrumental song called Lily Was Here from 1989, featuring saxophonist Candy Duffer. It's one of those, if you look up Lily Was Here and you play it, those of you that are around my age, you'll know the song. And the Eurythmics have sold somewhere between 75 and 100 million albums worldwide. And the Eurythmics went into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2022. Number 3 is Duran Duran. These were the ones I was confused about, because I didn't really associate Duran Duran with synth pop. And then the more I listened to some of their 80s stuff, I was like, oh no, there's loads of synth keyboard in there. And they are classified as synth pop or pop rock. If you really want to be technical, they're both. But again, kings of 1980s synth pop, kings of music in general then. Massive hit songs like Rio, Hungry Like the Wolf, Girls on Film, Save a Prayer. They even had success into the early 90s with songs like Ordinary World and Come Undone. We'll just forget about them covering Public Enemy's 911 as a joke. We'll just erase that. They were led by Simon Le Bon. He was the main singer, the main face of the band, who was all over MTV with their videos. Duran Duran has sold more than 100 million albums worldwide, and they were also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2022. And in case I forget, I got too far along there, Depeche Mode, who was number 1, they went into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2020. I don't want you to think that they did not get in. Number 4 is Tears for Fears. Tears for Fears, I would think their biggest hit song was Everybody Wants to Rule the World, which is one of those biggest quintessential 80s songs. But they had other massive hits with Head Over Heels, Shout, Sowing the Seeds of Love. They even had a brief 90s comeback in the early 90s with Break It Down Again. Tears for Fears has sold more than 30 million albums worldwide, with their 1985 Songs from the Big Chair selling more than 10 million copies. In a show of staying power, their 2022 album The Tipping Point actually reached number 1 on the US sales chart. Led by Roland Orzabal and Kurt Smith, Tears for Fears is critically acclaimed. They are not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, at least not as of yet. And finally, number 5 on the list of the best 1980 synth pop bands is New Order. They had a huge hit with Blue Monday. New Order, I find myself putting them on the top 5 as much for their influence going forward after as their actual success. New Order came out of the ashes of the band Joy Division after the suicide of Joy Division's lead singer Ian Curtis. Bernard Sumner came aboard to be the new lead vocalist, but they didn't want to keep the name Joy Division. Even though they are seen as two different musical acts, Joy Division and New Order have been nominated as one group for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 different times, yet to get in. Joy Division and New Order, I said the influence, they influenced a lot of the other bands that are on this list because they first came out in the late 70s with New Order obviously forming in 1980-81 and Blue Monday being their hit in 83. And you look at a lot of these other bands that had their hits come after that. So I chalk it up to if New Order, Joy Division influenced a lot of these other synth pop bands, then think about other acts that have been influenced by Eurythmics, Duran Duran, Tears for Fears, Depeche Mode, or even just Annie Lennox herself from the Eurythmics. It's like New Order, Joy Division, they were the jumping off point. But there you have it, my picks at least for the top 5 best 1980s synth pop bands. I will put a link in the podcast notes to the Best of the 80s Synth Pop playlist that I made on Spotify. Feel free to dive back into those days if you're from then, or if you're younger, go back and listen. You'll either really love the synth keyboard or you'll be sick of it within about 3 songs. Just so I am not the only one to feel old, just remember that the 1990s ended 27 years ago. Considering that my high school graduation was 30 years ago, I have to keep putting that in my head when I'm looking at things for nostalgia pop culture to put in the podcast. I consider 20 years ago to be when things start to become nostalgic, meaning technically 2006 now is my cutoff date. What I'm getting at is that some things that came around in the late 90s, early 2000s, I just seem to skip over as far as being nostalgia. And that's where this topic comes from here. TiVo doesn't seem like it should be that long ago, but yet it is. And it's hard to overstate its influence. There are few consumer electronics products that have changed TV viewing habits as dramatically as TiVo. It introduced the digital video recorder, DVR, which fundamentally altered the relationship between the viewer and TV programming. TiVo allowed you to record shows, pause live TV, skip commercials. It is a product that, even for a short time in the early 2000s, was so influential that its name was in the everyday language as far as instead of recording a show, you would TiVo it. That's as influential as saying you need a Band-Aid for a cut or a Ziploc bag for sealing something. The only problem was that as influential as TiVo was, everything else started catching up and the media landscape rapidly changed. The story of TiVo begins in the mid-1990s when 2 engineers, Jim Barton and Mike Ramsey, founded a Silicon Valley company called Teleworld in 1997. Both founders had previously worked in advanced computing and digital media projects, including at Silicon Graphics and Time Warner's full-service network. Initially, the company planned to develop a home networking device that would connect household electronics. However, during development, they pivoted toward an idea that would prove revolutionary, a device that could digitize television broadcasts and record them to a computer hard drive. At the time, most people were still relying on VHS tapes, VCRs, and while the 1980s kid in me would say that was revolutionary, it was a bit cumbersome and often unreliable. Plus, you could have siblings record over the stuff you recorded on your tapes, but you just make them eat leaves as revenge and we move on. Teleworld conducted its first public trials of the new technology in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1998. The company soon changed its name to TiVo Incorporated, and in 1999, it officially launched its digital video recorder product.
Say you're going to miss your favorite TV show because you have to go out of town. Unexpectedly. With a single command, your show can be digitally recorded every time it's on. No tapes, no hassles. Introducing TiVo. It puts you in control. With TiVo, you run the show.
The original TiVo device was codenamed Blue Moon during development because the team aimed to finish the product by March 31st, 1999, an actual blue moon. The first TiVo devices debuted in 1999 and were among the earliest consumer DVRs available to the public. These boxes contained hard drives that allowed users to store hours of television programming rather than on tape. The original system could digitize and compress analog television signals, record programming from cable, satellite, or antenna, store multiple hours of video on hard drive, and use a digital on-screen program guide to schedule recordings. This is where TiVo's user interface became one of its defining features, with that sound that it makes when you would move it around. Plus, the device included a distinctive animated mascot, this smiling television character, intuitive menus that made recording television far easier than programming a VCR. Some of the key early features of TiVo included the Season Pass, which automatically recorded every episode of a TV series, the wish list searches, which automatically record shows based on actor names, keywords, or topics. One of the most famous features was pausing live TV. Viewers could fast forward through recorded commercials. These capabilities were collectively known as time shifting, meaning viewers could watch programs whenever they wanted rather than when they aired. With timing being everything, TiVo launched during the dot-com boom and quickly attracted investment from major media companies including Comcast, Disney, NBC, and Showtime. In September 1999, TiVo went public with an initial public offering, raising roughly $88 million. Partnerships also helped expand the reach of TiVo, with a major milestone coming in 2000, when electronics manufacturer Philips released the DSR 6000, the first satellite receiver with an integrated TiVo DVR for DirecTV. These devices were often called DirecTV, combining satellite television service with TiVo's recording technology. In the early 2000s, TiVo became one of the most talked about gadgets in home entertainment. It was a huge part of pop culture. It was a new way to watch television, since TiVo freed the viewers from broadcast schedules. This was the birth of binge viewing. Although it was more popularized by streaming services years later, TiVo gave you the ability to store multiple episodes of specific shows, allowing you to watch them all in a row. As I said a minute ago, TiVo then became a verb. Just like Google has become synonymous with internet searching, TiVo in the early 2000s was shorthand for recording a television show. TiVo also was able to gather information about viewer habits. This allowed networks to analyze audience behavior. For example, TiVo famously reported spikes in replay activity during certain moments in major events like the Super Bowl halftime show, aka Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction. But what's interesting is that despite its influence, TiVo's early adoption was relatively modest compared to the broader television audience. One industry observer later called it the least successful, most significant consumer electronic device ever. It's sort of like looking at 6 Degrees, the original social media site. That is one of the most influential websites in the history of the internet. It basically created social media, and that site was so far ahead of its time and it bombed out. Now, TiVo wasn't a bomb, but it's the same idea. When you're the first of something brand new, naturally loads of other things are going to come along to improve upon it. Being the first means that you've got a lot of intellectual property, and this is what ended up becoming a part of TiVo's story, is that they held patents covering key aspects of DVR technology, particularly a system known as the time warp multimedia recording method. What this meant was that TiVo was allowed to pursue legal action against competitors. One of the most famous cases was the TiVo versus EchoStar case, which started in 2004, in which TiVo accused EchoStar and Dish Network of infringing its DVR technology patents. In 2011, after years of litigation, TiVo won significant settlements, including hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. Seeing the success or relative success of TiVo allowed a lot of others to start catching up in the mid-2000s. By then, cable and satellite providers began building DVR functionality directly into their own set-top boxes. This created some big challenges for TiVo, as cable companies could bundle DVR service with subscriptions, consumers no longer needed a separate TiVo device, and many providers offered similar recording features. Even though TiVo continued to release improved models, including high-def DVRs and network-connected features, the market share started to decline. Over the years, there were a lot of different TiVo models, the Series 1 and 2, which were the early 2000s, the Series 3, which was the first HD TiVo, the TiVo Premier in 2010, TiVo Romeo in 2013, the Bolt in 2015, and the Edge in 2019. They tried to keep up. They would offer access to apps like Netflix or YouTube, online scheduling of recording, even things like music and photo playback on the television. At its peak between 2006 and 2007, TiVo had roughly 4.4 million subscribers. I was trying to find how much TiVo, the corporation, was valued at its peak. The best that I could find was that when Rovi acquired TiVo in 2016, the company was sold for about $1.1 billion. By this point, we're looking at almost 10 years past the peak of the company. And then in the last 10 plus years came the rise of streaming platforms, and this dramatically changed how people consume video. Netflix, Hulu, on-demand cable systems, they reduced the need to record television programs. My mom has a cable box with the DVR capabilities, and she records a lot of shows, which is handy, but I look at things like I have Netflix, I don't need to record shows, unless the show is going off of Netflix. But additionally, like I said, cable providers include DVRs in their own boxes, like my mom's got. You've got streaming devices like Roku and Fire TV that provide easy access to content libraries, cloud recording systems replacing physical DVR hardware. All of this added up to 2025, just last year, TiVo officially ended production and sales of its DVR hardware. That's right, if you didn't know, TiVo is now a thing of the past. The company stopped selling its final DVR model, the TiVo Edge, and confirmed that it would no longer manufacture physical DVR products. Instead, now TiVo is shifting its focus towards software platforms like TiVo OS, which is a smart TV operating system, advertising technology, automotive and entertainment software. Despite not being able to buy a new TiVo, the company still supports existing TiVo boxes. Looking back now, 27 years from the launch of TiVo, its influence on television technology remains enormous. TiVo popularized pausing and rewinding live TV, easy digital recording, automatic recording of series, personalized content discovery, fast-forwarding through commercials. Many of these features later became standard across cable boxes, streaming platforms, and smart TV. In a more broad sense, TiVo helped to introduce the concept of on-demand viewing. And all of this influence forced others to play catch-up, which eventually cut down on TiVo's market share and at least drove the hardware portion out of business. So all of those streaming services out now, everyone who enjoys DVRing their favorite shows, a full season of it, or binging a full season, owe a debt of gratitude to the TiVo. It fundamentally changed how people watch TV, but the trends that it helped to start eventually made its original product obsolete. But until next week, that's going to wrap up episode 239 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for hopefully making it to the end. I hope you enjoyed your weekly dose of Gen X nostalgia, pop culture, a chance for us to feel young again, even if it's only for about an hour a week. Don't forget to go and check out the first Hidden Track podcast that went up on the main podcast feed just a few days ago. It is a bite-sized podcast, 10 to 15 minutes, kind of a in-depth look at topics that I have spoken about on the main show, usually in top fives or other list format segments. I'll be sharing these once a month, so for once a month you'll be getting 2 podcasts in a week. If you like my content, whether it's these podcasts, my social media videos, my blogs, any of my YouTube videos, any of my 10 books, you can support me by becoming a member on Patreon for $5 a month. You can buy me a coffee. If you can't part with your hard-earned money, you can just share my content, bring new eyes to the product. That means as much to me as any cash donation, and I've got a load of content. I figure if I've got thousands of pieces of content, that's more chances that people are going to find me through one thing. And if they come in through one door, there's a whole mall worth of different content, different stores to check out. And speaking of content, next week is episode 240 of the podcast. We're going to go back and look at the birth of the Comedy Central television network. We're going to go back in the day and celebrate the life, career, and genius of Prince as we get to 10 years since he died. We're going to look at some of the worst business decisions made in the 1990s. And we'll look back at the infamous time that Metallica sued Napster. So all of that is coming up next week on episode 240. It is probably about time that I start thinking about episode 250, which will end up being another listener's choice episode. I will have a few choices for you to vote on what you want me to talk about. I always laugh. I've done a few of these, and I do the polls, and people vote, but what I do is everything I put in there is stuff I'd want to talk about. It's not like I'm rooting for certain things, and if you vote for the other, I'm like, oh no, I've got to talk about stuff I don't like. Don't forget, also in the podcast notes is the link to be able to go and watch my acting debut film, Cape Cod Cthulhu. Me playing myself, the podcaster. Also, go to my YouTube channel and watch Frank Durant's Lady of the Dunes documentary. This past week was 4 years since that project debuted at the Provincetown Theater. Everything that I've done in my career basically since then, the Lady of the Dunes book, my acting debut I just mentioned, co-producing the short film When Henry Met Henry, which someday will be available, and my upcoming producing of a feature film, it all goes back to the Lady of the Dunes documentary. That and the fact that Frank Durant, and to a much smaller degree me, and the project had a little bit to do with that case being solved. If this is your first time listening to the podcast and you're wondering about the Lady of the Dunes, I've got several different segments about the Lady of the Dunes. That whole process, it was going on while I was doing the podcast. So I've got interviews with Frank, I've got talks about the case, the documentary. Episode 100 is the big, supersized episode all about the Lady of the Dunes. It's almost 2 hours. I'd say start there. We'll wrap this up as I get ready to grab my selfie stick and my phone and go out and find something interesting to film to share on social media. Who knows where I will be, but I'll be out there enjoying it as long as the weather is sunny, warm, things are blooming, spring is here. Yes, summer is coming eventually, but don't skip over spring to get to summer, because the quicker we get to summer, the quicker we get to fall and winter again. And until next time, remember, in this life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps, create your own path, and enjoy every moment you can on this journey we call life, because you never know what tomorrow brings. This has been the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterlin, but you already knew that. And I'll talk to you all again soon.